Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Get Out lecture. Alright, so with Get Out, the first thing I wanted to cover was some background info. So, Get Out is the directorial debut of comedian Jordan Peele, and it was an unexpected hit, and everyone started talking about it, and even today, it's been given a lot of attention. Interestingly enough, a lot of academic attention. Many scholars have studied this film, and it's being taught in schools more and more. I find when I was a teaching assistant at West Georgia, they had us teaching this. So and that was back in 2017 when it first came out. So even from when it first came out, it made a big impression. And the reason why is because it's known for its unique treatment of the topic of racism in the United States. And we're going to look at how it treats this topic, and that'll help us understand what it's going for rhetorically. Alright, so Get Out, with its historical and sociocultural context, these are important because they influence the message of the film. So, this film came out in 2017, so we have a historical context of the late 2010s, and this is, of course, the end. 2017, definitely, of course, is the end of the Obama presidency, and with the Obama presidency from 2008 to 2017, there was an idea, and this falls under socio-cultural context, that America had become, with its election of its first black president, a post-racial society. In other words, racism virtually couldn't exist because we'd elected a black president. But of course, that's fallacious to think it would be the case that racism would be over because of that. But there was a sentiment that we've done it, racism isn't a problem anymore. And I would argue that Jordan Peele is saying with this film that it is, even though it might not be too obvious, or it might manifest in ways that aren't so obvious. So that's what Get Out, I would say, is getting at with its messaging. And, of course, with more historical context, this is, of course, in the Black Lives Matter era, which began in 2012 with the death of Trayvon Martin and continues to this day, and sort of reached its apex last year with George Floyd. So, of course, racial tensions are not over in the United States, despite what some people might have liked to think. And that really is reflected with the quote from the movie: is being African American in the modern world an advantage or disadvantage? What that person, a member of the Coagula, he asked Chris this. And it's sort of a patronizing question. And it assumes a post-racial US that racism is over, quote unquote, not, or at least not as serious a problem as it was in the past, to a point where being black could be an advantage. And that whole mindset is how the Coagula come to fetishize and commodify black bodies, which is a form of racism itself, the movie shows us. Get Out is a horror movie, of course, and it has a purpose, and we talked about purpose before: entertain, inform, persuade. It, of course, has a purpose to entertain. It wants to scare us for the thrill of it, but it also wants to persuade us. And when you think about it, a horror movie is a good vehicle for persuading someone because you're appealing to their emotions by scaring them. And of course, the emotion here is fear. And of course, an appeal to emotion is an appeal to pathos. So basically, what is being said here on the most basic level is racism is horrific. because this is a horror movie about racism. What does that say about racism? That it's horrible, that it's scary, that it's horrific. So horror movies usually use our 5 basic fears in order to scare us. So there are 5 fears that are universal. Extinction, which of course means we're afraid of dying. Mutilation, we're afraid of being injured. Loss of autonomy, we're afraid of losing control, and this could fall under being trapped or literally losing control of our bodies. And we see that manifested in movies about demonic possession or something like that. And of course, being lost and trapped, that also would fall under loss of autonomy. Separation, losing your loved ones. We see that in this movie with Chris losing his mother, for example. And we're also afraid of ego death, or losing our sense of self. So of these 5 basic fears, I think this film uses a lot of them, but probably the biggest one is loss of autonomy. And we're going to talk about how that is. Of course, with the hypnotism aspect, we see that. And the black people in the film do lose their bodies. Their bodies are taken over by white brains in the film. And that translates into what I see in this film as a metaphor for slavery, because these black bodies that the Coagula want for themselves, they could be seen as commodities. It isn't that they're using the bodies for labor, they're using the bodies for their own personal gain. They prefer these physical characteristics of black people. But still, these black bodies are used as commodities as they were in centuries past. We can see the bingo game as a sort of modern slave auction, because that's essentially what it is. They're all playing to win Chris. And the other image of slavery we see in this is with Chris picking cotton from the chair in order to save himself. So he plugs up his ears with cotton so he doesn't get hypnotized. He picks cotton, so it's ironic because of course slaves were used for picking cotton in centuries past. So he ironically saves himself by picking cotton. All right. Another big theme in the film is casual racism, which Jordan Peele really presents as just as big a problem as more overt racism. And the fact that it exists sort of discredits the whole idea of a post-racial U.S. So the plot of the Coagula is similar to slavery, like we established. And that said, it's not really implemented by the sort of people you'd think it would be implemented by. This film takes place in liberal New York. The Armitages are upper-class white liberals who would have voted for Obama a 3rd time if they could have. So they are not what you think of when you think of racism. These are not backcountry, poor people living in the southern U.S. These are rich white liberals. Not what you'd expect. But they are still subject to racism, even if it's in a casual form. And like Rose says in the film, they're no different than that cop who wanted to see Chris's ID even though he wasn't driving. So casual racism is a reality, and it can be just as destructive as more overt racism, and we see that in the fact that the Armitages carry out this horrible plot, right? And we also see that with Jim Hudson, who says, "I don't care what color you are, Chris, I just want your eyes." And the fact that he's blind, that should make him not racist at all, right? Because he can't see color. But he is still participating in the Coagula's plot. He still lets that racism happen. So Jordan Peele presents it as a problem of not only being actively, overtly racist, but also of allowing racism to continue even and even allowing more casual quote-unquote racism to continue can have really dire destructive consequences, even though we might not realize it because we might think we live in a post-racial society, but obviously we do not. So yes, because at the end of the day, the Coagula don't objectify black people because they hate them, right? They admire them, they want to be them, but that still is objectification of these people, dehumanization of these people, and it still is racism. So the whole idea is casual racism should not be overlooked. It's just as harmful as more overt racism. I also wanted to talk about the theme of colonialism in the film, because I think it goes hand in hand with the anti-racism in the film. The film is also very much anti-colonialism. So speaking of the objectification and dehumanization of black people, Dean, the Armitage father, he calls himself a world traveler, and he shows Chris around the house talking about souvenirs and how he collects from other cultures and how it's a privilege to participate in other cultures. And that sort of marks him as being similar to colonizers of America of centuries past. And going back to what we talked about on the last slide, Dean Armitage is wealthy. He is not a poor backcountry, stereotypical racist person living in the southern U.S. And I think his location, his geographical location, is significant because think about it. He is living in a part of the country where the first colonies were set up in New York, around New England, right? So he really emerges as a colonist, or a colonizer figure, I would definitely say. And that gets us to the symbol of the deer heads. They're trophies, they're hunting trophies, and they sort of represent that to the Armitages and the Coagula. Black people are trophies too, animals to be hunted. And we see that also in the symbol of the lion. There is a stuffed lion on Chris's desk or his nightstand, and I sort of took it to mean it was patronizing. They were basically telling Chris, the Armitages, that they think of him as this exotic African animal that needs to be subdued and put in a zoo. And, you know, early in the film, Dean Armitage, the dad, does say, "I hate deer. I think they're rats. They're an infestation." And that sort of reflects how he really feels deep down about black people, that they need to be controlled, subdued, etc. And not only the stuffed lion, if you noticed, let me pull it up actually. The arms of Missy's chair where she hypnotizes Chris have lions on them. So of course that image of the lions, it's a patronizing image to Chris. You are just an animal, you are exotic and fascinating, and we mean to control you, to colonize you, what have you. So yeah, I don't think it's any accident that the lions are on that chair, this chair where she takes control of him. And not only that, but we can see colonialism manifest with Rose as well. At the end of the movie, you know, she eats her Fruit Loops because she's basic, and she and yeah, even we might laugh at that, but it shows just how she is the one who is really animal, right? Because she is very basic. And she is a colonizer herself. Notice she has hunting trophies. She has pictures of her boyfriends on her wall, like deer heads. So, she does become a huntress herself, and she does hunt down Chris at the end of the film, even though we might have expected her to be on Chris's side, but no, she's a victim of racism in that she is racist. So yes, Rose emerges as a colonizer figure. She's wearing white, which is ironic because, as we discussed previously, white often represents purity, but in this case, the color is used ironically, and it sort of matches, now that I think about it, that white car, which is also used for the Armitage's plot, because we see that white car at the beginning. And now that I think about it, Chris is using their tools of colonization against them, because he also uses the deer head to slaughter let's look at that, to slaughter Dean. Alright, so we see all of that, how this is we have a theme of colonialism here. The next theme I wanted to talk about was privilege and class. So let's get back to that white car. So the fact that the car is white, on a very basic level, it reflects the race of the villains, of course. But on a deeper level, when you think about it, it also really shows how privileged they are, because the white car is conspicuous. It's easy to see. If you were going to kidnap someone, as we see in the beginning of the film, when Jeremy is kidnapping Andre Hayworth, you would not choose a car easy to spot. So the fact that they use such an obvious car is because they know they can get away with what they're doing, because they're white, rich people, and more often than not, unfortunate as it is, they could get away with what they're doing. I think privilege also is symbolized in the silver spoon that is the hypnotist, that is the hypnotist tool in the film. It really reminds me of the phrase to be born with a silver spoon in one's mouth, which means one was born into privilege. And the spoon, of all colors, they chose silver. Of course, that's the obvious go-to, but at the same time, I can see the symbolism inherent in the fact that a silver spoon, is the hypnotism tool, so exerting their privilege over their victims. Alright. We also have the sunken place itself, and I have Chris on each slide falling into the sunken place. So the sunken place, it quite literally is putting black people beneath them by putting them in the sunken place. So that also would be exerting one's privilege, exerting one's class over others. So we can see literally putting someone below them. That's what the sunken place seems to represent. And at the end of the day, though, the film really plays with the idea of class and shows that even though these people, the Armitages, are rich and affluent and high class, quote unquote, they are very primitive, of course, with what they're doing, with their plot. It is ironic that a brain surgeon is doing something so backwards and so cruel and so crazy. So we see the irony inherent in that. Let's look at that operating room for a second. The operating room is lit with candles, and the candles really are emphasized in that they sort of frame Dean, who is our emphasis here in this image. So that is very strange. It is this technologically advanced medical procedure with candle lighting that really is incongruous. It shows that even though these people on the outside seem to be advanced, high class, etc., smart, they really are primitive with the use of candles symbolizes that. And what they have, the candles also have fire, obviously, and and Dean talks about mortality and how it's reflected by how it's reflected in fire, which burns a little bit and then dies. He looks into the fireplace and talks about how fire reflects mortality. So he really has a primitive fear of death. So these people, even though on the outside they seem high class and affluent and advanced and smart, they really are primitive. And I think that also comes out with the fact that, of all things, what does Jeremy wear to kidnap Andre Hayworth? He wears a, if you notice this, he's wearing a knight's helmet. So that also, a medieval knight. And I think there also might be a potential reference to the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in his helmet. But it just goes to show, it's another symbol of how primitive these people are, ironically, even though they live in a nice house, and are rich and have high-paying, respected jobs. Brain surgeon, hypnotist, well, psychotherapist, or psychiatrist, rather. So yes, it's very ironic that they have these symbols of primitivism around them. Alright, I know some people in my class said, some people in one of the classes said they don't do demons, but we have to do demons really quick. I apologize. So I want to talk about the Coagula themselves. Their name is Latin for joined together, and of course we can see how appropriate that is because they're joining their white brains with the black bodies. It also might be a reference to the figure of Baphomet, who's often associated with Satanism and the Church of Satan. He has the words salve, separate, and coagula joined together on his arms. And I can't help but be reminded of the deer head with his horns. So he really is appropriate as a symbol for the Coagula, because of course, being associated with Satanism, he's shorthand for evil. So it's communicating that the Coagula are evil, occult also, because of course this is an occult image. In our minds, we would associate this with the occult. And yeah, he reflects the plot of the Coagula because he has that deer head, which we established as a symbol of colonialism, and he has even the word coagula on his arm. So that's where I think the name comes from, and I think it does really make a lot of sense. Something else about the Coagula is that by and large they wear black, and of course we talked about how black represents darkness and evil in costuming. They also wear red, which definitely symbolizes bloodshed in this case, because of course these people are doing these bizarre surgeries and mutilating black people, so it represents their violence. They drive black cars and arrive in what looks like a funeral procession, and let's look at that really quick. So these are the Coagula members coming, and their little funeral procession, quote unquote, really shows that they are bringers of, well, they don't kill the black people necessarily, but it is sort of ironic because the Coagula, as we established before, they really fear mortality, and they seek immortality through their project or their plot with stealing black bodies. So that is just another ironic image. Something else I wanted to note is the is the symbol of the Omega symbol on the house, or the house's planters, rather. So I don't know if y'all noticed, but these are Greek letters, the Omega symbol. And this sort of goes along with the idea that these people are a fraternal, quote-unquote, organization, because we often associate Greek letters with fraternities and sororities. So they do describe themselves as a family, and their victims as being enfolded into the quote-unquote twisted family, as it were. So on one level it might represent that. It's also the last letter in the Greek alphabet, which symbolizes, and it can symbolize death, and this being the end for all of the black victims who arrive at this house. So that is interesting as well. And overall, these people, the Armitages, the Coagula, just seem obsessed with death and preventing it for themselves. And even though they say you won't be gone to the black victims, are trapped and are dead in a sense. This is just incidental, but I also think it's interesting that we meet the family from afar. That just shows how distant they are. And of course, thinking of mise-en-scene, we have the groundskeeper, who is really the Armitage patriarch, Dean's father, looking over them because he knows what is about to happen with Chris. So there's that, and I also like the fact that there is yellow all throughout the house, because yellow, it's the dominant color in the house. And it can symbolize danger if you think of things like caution tape, a yellow traffic light, etc. So I don't think the choice of color was incidental. This is a very dangerous place, and that's communicated to us subtly through color. So what we need to talk about now is the theme of the police, which I think Jordan Peele makes a comment about in this film. Because, of course, there is a reference to racial profiling in the casually racist cop at the beginning of the movie. And there's also the police that Rod goes to for help, and of course they're useless. They don't believe him, they laugh at him, etc. And I don't think it's accidental that there is an American flag on the detective's desk, because how the detectives treat Rod when he tells them what is going on with the Coagula and Chris being missing, it just shows that, in Jordan Peele's view at least, the American justice system is flawed. And I also think it's extremely interesting that there is a black woman as a detective. So it might not be what we expect. She just goes to show that everyone must band together against racism, no matter what their race is, and has to recognize that racism comes in all forms, and sometimes even just that casual racism that we see in this film can be just as horrific, just as destructive as more overt racism. And of course, at the end, Rose tries to make it look like Chris is attacking her because she sees a quote-unquote cop car, but thankfully it just it happens to actually be Rod, thankfully. So she knows that she can use her race to her advantage, and that just shows how unfortunately ubiquitous racial profiling is in America in Jordan Peele's estimation. So that is just another example because Chris looks defeated when he's clearly the victim here. So yeah, it just shows how much of a problem it continues to be. So overall, what is the message here? What is it that this film is communicating that you have to identify in your essay? Well, there are several possibilities, and I don't want you to simply repeat what I say if you see something different. But from what I gather in rhetorically analyzing this film, and remember, in rhetorical analysis, you search for the main point, and the main point is often at the beginning or the end. In this case, I think it's at the beginning. I think Chris says that Rose's parents should know he is black before he goes to meet them. But Rose counters that with her mythical view of a post-racial America by saying, my dad would have voted for Obama a third time. She advances what Jordan Peele communicates is false, that racism is not an issue anymore. And in a post-racial America, there's also the idea that colorblindness is a thing when it really shouldn't be. Jordan Peele says it should be acknowledged that Chris is different racially, and it should be accepted. It doesn't need to be ignored. It doesn't need to be unstated. It should be acknowledged and accepted in order for us to get along and understand that there is a difference between a black person and a white person, and that's okay. Instead of pretending that everyone is the same, because we are different, and there is nothing wrong with being different. So I think the message really lies in that sentiment, that difference is real, difference is okay, and in order to defeat racism, we just have to accept each other's differences, and not covet them, like the Coagula do, because that is a form of racism itself, objectifying, fetishizing, commodifying these black people and their characteristics. Instead, just accept that they are different, and that you are different, and then that's okay. And because I have this image here, I also wanted to note that Chris, of course, is trapped, literally in the house, but metaphorically also in racism, which takes on many forms. And I think his blue jean jacket really emphasizes that. We talked about how blue means peace, or it means sadness, etc. But in this case, and I did a lot of thinking about it, I think blue communicates being frozen. Because in the sunken place, we see blue lighting on Chris, and I think that really does communicate that he is trapped, he's frozen, he can't move, etc. because of racism, and because he literally is trapped in the movie. But is he the only one who's trapped? Because we do have Rose wearing this striped shirt. It's red. The stripes are red, so of course that could tip us off that she is a violent, murderous person like the rest of her family. But perhaps she is trapped too. She's a victim of racism also, and that it corrupts her, and it corrupts the Armitages. It's a horrible, horrible force. And with her stripes, well, like we said with the Twilight Zone example, that could represent a prisoner, so she might be trapped as well. No one benefits from racism. It's a horrible thing. So, at the end of the day, Peele presents racism as still being an active problem, even if it doesn't appear to be so. And indeed, I was a little bit hesitant to pick this movie because it's relatively old, but also relatively recent, from 2017. And I think it was rather prescient in that it did, quote-unquote, predict what would transpire after it, with things like the Charlottesville riots in 2017 and George Floyd being killed in 2020. So racism is manifesting with violence, as it does in this movie. So it's still a very relevant movie to this day, which really surprised me, so I'm very glad that I chose to finally do it after meaning to for a while now. And, going back to rhetorical analysis and thinking of textual structures like we talked about, I feel like Peele uses a problem-solution structure here, and that he lays out this problem of racism for us to see. And he ultimately says we all need to unite against it, everyone, and not just overlook it, like those cops who Rod went to for help, even though they were black. They were overlooking racism and ignoring what he was telling them and laughing him off. So everyone needs to unite against racism of all races, of all creeds, etc., etc. We all need to get out, as it were, of racism. Alright, so that is what we had to say about Get Out. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you find this useful in crafting your paper. As I alluded to before, you don't have to, and I don't want you to, regurgitate what was said here, but maybe use some of the thoughts I present in order to build your own argument about the rhetorical message Get Out sends. Alright, thank you guys so much, and I'll see y'all next time.